Now with the cars on the grid for the big event of the day, the 50-mile commemoration event of the Australian Grand Prix. We'll take it back to our main commentary position for a rundown on the grid and of course our course commentary. Thank you.
This particular car is an ERA 1500cc supercharged car built in about 1937 and being driven by Englishman Bill Morris. This is the sister car of a stable of two which were owned by the Prince Beera, and one was called Hanyaman, which is the one you see now, and the other was Remus, which was an identical motor car. And these were raced over many years before the war by Prince Beera, who was a Siamese royal and lived in England.
Now, car 78 is Kevin Shearer in the A model Ford.
Was really fastest in practice, and is at the moment going ahead. The car streams into Southern Loop. Lots of noise, lots of spray, and we'll wait just a little while before we sort out the field for you. At the moment it's Morris leading in one of the most famous ERAs of all time. English racing automobiles, designed and built by Raymond Mays, Peter Burton, all the people who were responsible for the original BRMs.
The second car is the A model Ford of Kevin Shearer's from South Australia, and this car is built on the American three-quarter dirt track car. He sits very, very high in it. The car has only been running for 3 or 4 years, but it's very consistent competitor. Travels all over Australia with it, drives it particularly hard, and at the moment lying in second place.
Third place is Joel Finn in the ex-Peter Whitehead ERA, another 1500cc car with R10B, this one. The other ERA is R12B. Joel Finn, an American, bought the car specially for this race.
And of course this has an enormous amount of historic significance, I should say, here, because it is the car that Peter Whitehead won the 1938 Australian Grand Prix at Bathurst.
There's a beautiful shot of Morris as he streaks up towards Lukey in this superb, wonderful car. One of my favourite cars of all time, the ERA.
These cars were originally based on Riley components.
Yes, with twin camshafts, not overhead though. They're very high mounted in the block. And then with the big supercharger there, pumping the fuel-air mixture into that engine at quite a rate.
Sometimes the engine horsepower would all be taken up to drive the supercharger, and you might use 100 horsepower to drive the supercharger to get 200 horsepower out of the engine.
There were a number of cars made by ERA, and they varied from 1100cc engines through 1500, right up to 2 litres, and even over 2 litres. The bigger engine ones were not quite so successful as the 1500s though.
There was only 22 of these cars ever manufactured, and there's now 23 running because they found enough spares to build the 23rd car.
This is one of the magnificent things as we see the finish of the first lap. Morris streaking and shrieking away from the field with that car. One of the wonderful things about vintage racing in England, of course, is the fact that there are usually half a dozen or so of these cars running in any given major event, such as the Seaman Trophy.
Unfortunately, we don't have the heritage of all the beautiful factory-built racing cars. In fact, a lot of them did go back to England at the time when they were nobody's baby. However, we've still got quite a few, and there's one of them, for instance, the blue K3 with the red crash helmet on coming down the straight, and that's Peter Brady from South Australia, supercharged 1100cc car. Peter Brady always drives it very, very hard indeed every time he brings it out, and it was his father's car, and it has been bequeathed to Peter's son, so Peter is only custodian of it until his son's old enough to drive it. Having a big dice there with one of the Austin 7s. In fact, there's many of Austin 7s. They're all around the circuit at the moment.
That's Max Foster's car. Here we have the leader again. They're going through Repco Corner. A pity they have to wear those helmets, as it spoils the effect.
I think that full-face helmets shouldn't really be allowed in historic racing, Paul. As you say, completely spoils the whole aesthetic look of seeing an old motor car at full song and a bloke wearing a full-face helmet.
We have a report that Joel Finn's car, the other ERA, is unfortunately running very raggedly. They were having trouble with it in practice, and they can't work out. They believe it's an electrical problem, but it's not going very well at all, which is a great shame. Lindsay Wogan has pulled off at Shell Kick. That's in car 33, you can see there, the Riley.
That's Brooklyn's Riley, that particular car. Here comes Kevin Shearer again in the white A model Ford with the twin rooster tails of water as he makes his way up round Lukey Heights.
It's going particularly well today.
Always goes very, very hard and fast, this car. He drove it in the rain at Oran Park and the All Historic meeting up there, so he's getting fairly used to it. He hunches up over the steering wheel, very seldom ever moves it out of top gear. I would say he probably is second at NGK, and Joel Finn has the car running again. He's sitting up on the tail of Kevin Shearer at the moment, sliding the tail out now as he goes up around behind the top.
Well, at the moment, Morris has a lead of 7.5 seconds over Shearer. So it's not that long a gap, but they're coming down now to complete the second of these 17 laps.
Having a lonely old drive out there in the lead, but looking about, there's plenty of dicing going on further back in the field, and we'll pick up some of the dices as this race progresses.
There's Kevin Shearer. With Joel Finn hanging on to third place, but with a very rough motor.
Now here's a bit of dicing coming on. The green Alta on the right-hand side of the screen, having a big dice with the blue Ballot Olsenfield of Richard Creed. This is the ex-Jim Gullen car. Down they come, down the main straight, into the sweeping right-hander. Graham Lowe in the supercharged Alta. And I should say Tony Gaze, who brought this car to Australia, who's here today, will be very, very green with envy not being out there having a dice.
You can tell us something about the Ballot Olds, can't you?
Well, I certainly can, Paul. It's a car that's very close to my heart. The car, I first drove it, I think, back in about 1950 at the Corio grass track, and I had 3 wins and a third, and that's probably the most success I've ever had in my whole life of motor racing. It's a 6-cylinder side valve Oldsmobile engine mounted to an Oldsmobile gearbox with a 1924 2-litre Ballot chassis, narrowed and shortened. And here comes Ron Reed in the Solomon Singer, probably one of the most famous motor cars racing in Australia.
Very spectacular driver too.
Oh, very spectacular driver, Ron Reed. His son is also driving. There they come with the Bugatti, the blue Bugatti with the green full-face helmet. And look at the wheel tramp. Oh, a tremendous amount of wheel tramp under brakes there. Ron Reed, the scarf blowing in the breeze. The Bugatti getting around the corner just a little bit quicker. And the Ballot Olds just sitting ahead of this car of Ron Reed's, the Solomon Singer, was built for dirt track racing. Tom Solomon introduced dirt track racing pre-war to the English, and then he bought the car out here, and there was a sister car that also ran with it. It's since been destroyed, unfortunately. It uses the Fraser Nash front and rear end originally. It's now got a conventional diff in it, and it's a 1934 single-Le Mans engine.
Certainly, I always like watching Ron Reed. He sometimes terrifies the life out of you in fast corners like at Sandown, you know, the way he hangs it out.
The late Max Stewart would always be seen hanging over the fence to watch Ron Reed go around corners. And he always felt he was a very brave fellow, and he could never quite understand it at all.
He's no chicken either, is he?
No, I suppose Ron must be getting very close to 60 years old now, and a bloke who really enjoys his historic racing.
Have you counted how many Bugattis we've got here today?
There were 16, which is absolutely incredible, one meeting. And talking to Graham Steinford from the Vintage Sports Car Club, he tells me that there is listed for, in the entries, there were 50 supercharged factory racing cars in all for the whole meeting, not necessarily all in the one race, but Richard Creed in the Ballot Olds sitting up on the tail of the Bugatti. I haven't actually picked up whose Bugatti that one is as yet.
No, it's no number on it.
makes it a bit difficult.
One car I did just see in picture there for a moment was car 58, which you see there leading this group, is Graham Lowe in his Alta, Grand Prix Alta. Geoffrey Taylor, of course, was one of the all-time greats of building racing cars, and this is one typical example of the earlier ones.
And it has a Wilson pre-selected gearbox in it, which is quite common for the period, but very uncommon in a racing car of modern design.
Well, this is the 2-litre engine that Geoffrey Taylor built. Virtually hand-built the engines with welded-up water jackets and so on. Twin camshafts, used in many other cars after his own. The HWMs used them, and many sports cars. Very, very fine engineer, but never really reached the top.
Well, there's the Bugatti going round the outside of Graham Lowe, and Graham Lowe looking just a little bit surprised. No, he's not going to have that. No fear. No, he put his foot down and says, to hell with that. Gets the supercharger really cracking now. Graham Lowe still shaking his head. How did that happen? Here comes the Bugatti, having another go at him again. Moving right up on his tail. Round the outside of one of the Austin 7s they go. The Ballamol's getting into the act. Richard Creed, probably known as the Incredible, moving up, and he's going to have a go too. And this is certainly no parade, this Jubilee scratch race.
Well, I can tell you that the leader is lapping at an average of 60 miles an hour in these conditions, and that is incredible. In practice, he was lapping at around about 2 minutes 20 seconds, and that's in a 1937 motor car, compared with, say, Peter Brock in his Tirana today, who will be doing a 150s.
Well, it's a great pity that it is so wet, because we don't really sort of know the true potential of any of the cars today, except the Austin 7 blokes are all rubbing their hands together because that lets them go a lot quicker.
That's right. Of course, this will be the first time in many, many years that they've had vintage and historic racing here at Phillip Island.
Yes, well, I think the cars were still relatively new the last time.
That's right, they weren't historic or vintage in those days. Going up to Lukey, that little group of cars we've been watching for a while now, with Richard Creed at the second of those 2 blue cars. Richard Creed, he used to be a very keen rally man, but now almost totally dedicated towards the vintage side of things. Down into NGK corner they go. Richard Creed, the third of those 3 cars.
We found it Stuart Saunders from Canberra in the 535. We just found the number on the tail. It's put on with some water paint, and that's why it's very hard to see.
There's Morris, the leader, cutting through some of the rear cars, the back markers, as he goes into Lockbit's corner. Driving very well indeed. There are 4 laps completed, and we're following car 24 here, Peter Hitchin with his Hudson Special, a 1936 car with a 3.5 litre Hudson engine.
This is probably one of the most famous Australian specials, built by ex-president of the Australian Racing Drivers Club in Sydney, Bill Ford. It was commonly known as the Petticoat Special, and we'll tell you why when we get a shot of the tail of the car, because it has a canvas body stretched with aeroplane dope. The car is a beast of a thing to handle, and you'll see it's a long-arm driving position, and he really works hard at it. A typical car of the immediate pre- and post-war era, has beaten many factory racing cars in its heyday. It has no right to do, but it did. And Peter's been campaigning this car for quite some period of time. There's a shot of the tail. You see the canvas tight between the bows around the tail of it. And he's really sitting in the car, working very, very hard indeed. It's a car that you've really got to stand over. And Peter does an excellent job. Phil Morris, 2:52 to the leader. You see how hard the car is strung, bounces around as he goes over the bumps in it. Ron Reed in the Salmon Singer, moving round to the tail of Peter Hitchens in the Hudson.
I just saw out of the corner of my eye there, the Maserati 4CLT 48 leave the pits.
Ah, good.
So here we have, here he is, car 49, Tim Hewison, in this car which was once driven by Fangio. A car that really kept Maserati going for many years. It was preceded by the 4CL model. We have one of those here today, unfortunately not running. but that was a pre-war car. These were virtually a redesign of that, produced and run for the first time at San Remo in 1948. Therefore it was known as the San Remo model. It's got a 4-cylinder engine, supercharged, 16 valves, and a non-detachable head. Very, very good car in its day, but was very much overshadowed later by the Alfa Romeo Type 158 and 159, and of course the V12 4.5-litre Ferraris as well.
This car, of course, is two-stage supercharged. It's got one supercharger that pumps into the second one. A very, very harsh exhaust note indeed, and because of the supercharging, it's a fairly hard car on plugs. You have to start the car on warm-up plugs, get it warm, get all the oil warm, which is dry sump principle, same as they use today, and then when it's thoroughly warm, the whole car, then they've got to put the hard racing plugs in and not let it get cold. You might have noticed some of the cars all wrapped up and muffled up on the start. It wasn't to keep them dry, it was to keep them warm so that they wouldn't wreck their hard plugs, because today modern racing cars run on super-grade petrol, whereas these style cars all ran on alcohol, which is very, very cold fuel indeed.
Well, this car, in fact, is one of the weird things with a gear change between the driver's legs. He has to fiddle around under the wheel to get at the gear change because, of course, the gearbox is between his legs too. And they were later developed by a Brazilian and called a Maserati Plate. In an unsupercharged form, they had a 2-litre engine and ran as Formula 2 cars before the appearance of the A6G models and later 250Fs, both of which are very famous cars in their day. But this is, it's very rare to see a 4CLT 48 running, and personally I haven't seen one for many, many years. This car, in fact, did run at Indianapolis in a post-war time.
A car with a tremendous amount of history, and it's great to see that Tim Hewison has brought this car back to Australia to run in historic racing. Coming up into the picture now is the cream P-Type MG. This is the car that Les Murphy won the 1935 Australian Grand Prix here at Phillip Island on the old circuit. Car in unsupercharged form, not as quick as the supercharged version, but good enough to win a Grand Prix nevertheless over those atrocious roads that they had to run in. Wells has got something much to say.
Yes, that year that Les won in that car, he started off 53 minutes in front of the stretch man, who was Bill Thompson in a Bugatti. And Bill, in fact, was still in having luck when Les left alive.
And Graham Steinford driving the car, beautifully restored it back to its original colours. Great little motor car, and doing a sterling job there. Likewise, some of the Austin 7s, and they certainly won't win the race, but that's not what historic racing's all about. It's being part of and just shoving the car off and going out and having a day's fun. Be it 100 in the shade or very wet. It doesn't make any difference to a historic driver. They all just get into it and have a go. That looks as though, with 7 laps completed, it's John Needham in the little supercharged Ulster Austin. A very hard-charging Austin driver, drives it interstate, and there's a dice going on between Steinford, who's also a great Austin 7 lover, and John Needham having a ding-dong battle around the back of the circuit. There's nobody else in the race for these two guys as they rush around the back of the circuit, but they're now being swallowed up by one of the 8-cylinder Bugattis and swamped that little dice. And it hasn't resolved itself yet either, Paul. They're still well and truly hard at it.
Well, they're just heading down into Repco Corner, and the road holding is quite incredible of these cars. You'd think they'd be sliding off all over the place, but no, they're just hanging in there beautifully. There's Max Foster again in little blue Austin 7 there.
Just going around the